throughout the history. Another important lesson has to do with incentive systems. It has been proved again by the current financial crisis that aggressive short-term incentive systems for CEOs and professionals in financial institutions tend to make them focus on short-term operating results rather than enhancing the medium-term value of the firms. Therefore, it would be more appropriate that compensation systems for management and professionals be based on longer-term performance. Now, although optimism will help overcome an economic crisis, governments must remain prudent. People who worry about excessive fiscal deficits and potential inflation driven by excess liquidity insist that an early exit strategy should be pursued. But let me remind you that the Great Depression in the 1930s and the lost decade of Japan are classic examples of policy failures in which too early exit strategy prolonged recessions. We should remember that these exit strategies prompted a second crisis that extended the recession. Therefore, central bankers are expected that they would be prudent in the timing of an exit strategy. Although Korea shows signs of economic recovery at a faster rate than other economies, the high level of its external dependency suggests that it should adopt an exit strategy in line with the pace of economic recovery of the advanced economies. The economist Joseph Schumpeter coined the concept of creative destruction. Once a market matures, crisis comes, and a self-destroying bust cycle follows. However, this normally leads to a creative process of developing new products and technologies. In simpler terms, new opportunities emerge from every crisis. Someone once told me that a recession is good, but a crisis is even better because the latter presents opportunities for those who are prepared to face the challenges involved. In conclusion, I believe that now is the right time for us to actively intermediate those who seek capital with those who can provide capital. Now is the time for companies to strengthen their core competencies and be proactive in their portfolio management. Now is the time to demonstrate entrepreneurship to overcome the current crisis and secure a prosperous future. This concludes my presentation. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you very much. Now we know the proper role for Korea, the world's undertaker. Our next speaker is Mr. Kang Chung-won, CEO of Kookmin Bank. I've known CW for 26 years now. We were colleagues at Bankers Trust. In his soft-spoken way, at every level, he just did his job better than anybody else in similar positions. So it's not surprising that today we find him as CEO of what I believe is Korea's largest bank. It's the bank with the highest customer satisfaction rating. It's the bank with the highest credit rating in Korea. It's the bank with the highest profitability in Korea. So it's our privilege to hear his views. CW.
Thank you, Bill, for your kind words. It's a great honor and pleasure to be here in Jeju Island, attending the Jeju Peace Forum. and I have another pleasure of meeting up with an old friend after about 10 years. Both Dr. Overholt and I had worked for Bankers Trust Company in the 80s and 90s, during which time we witnessed the successful transformation of the 8th largest commercial bank in the U.S. into a derivatives powerhouse, calling itself a wholesale merchant bank. I experienced the Asian final crisis of 10 years ago as Bankers Trust country head in Korea. And I'm now still experiencing the impact of the most recent global financial crisis as CEO of the largest Korean commercial bank. With this background, I will share with you selective and personal interpretation and analysis on two topics. First is the development of derivatives business as it relates to the current crisis, and the second on the problem of US dollar liquidity crunch, which basically was the highlight of the current global financial crisis in many East Asian countries, particularly Korea. First on derivatives, I don't know much about other professions, but bankers, the problem with bankers is that we learn the hard way and then we forget. Bankers Trust indeed spearheaded the derivatives business from mid-80s and had become a major player in interest rate, currency, and equity derivatives by mid-90s. Huge profits were made and huge bonuses were paid. Products often became more important than customers, while derivative structures incorporated leverage and started to cover exotic currencies in pursuit of higher spread. Internal control and risk management functions of the bank were falling behind the business side as they could not keep up with the rapidly growing business volume and sophistication of products. The resulting prevalence of unsound sales practices and undisciplined risk management soon led to a series of major lawsuits from unhappy derivatives customers, as well as a large loss by a rogue derivatives trader. Regulators swamped the bank trying to fix its internal control and risk management system, among others. The bank experienced extreme difficulty renewing its funding from the wholesale lenders, and the Federal Reserve finally approved the first acquisition of a major US bank by a European bank, Deutsche Bank, in 1999 to remove this potential system risk from the market. During this period, Bankers Trust competitors in the derivatives business, most investment banks and a few large global banks, strengthened the functions of compliance, internal control, and risk management, not only upon recommendation from the regulators, but also for their own survival. The concept of suitability test, which required banks to document their efforts to check the suitability of their derivatives products to customers, business, and financial risk profile, was also introduced and implemented during this time. In the aftermath of Asian financial crisis and following the collapse of Bankers Trust in 1999, credit derivatives emerged as a new growth engine for investment bankers. Derivatives on US subprime mortgage credits and corporate bonds in the form of CDOs and CDS saturated the US market and overflowed to Europe and partly to Asia. This time, the products carried high leverage, and it was often difficult to explain their risk-return profile to customers. As these were essentially credit products, credit agencies were brought in, or they stepped in for business to solve this hard-to-explain problem by assigning ratings to such derivatives instruments. Sales to less informed customers became easier. At the core of this credit derivatives disaster, again we found unsound sale practice and undisciplined risk management. We are reminded that the foundation of sound banking consists of selling products that will suit our clients and investing in products whose risk profile that we understand and are capable of managing within certain parameters. Most East Asian economies need to develop more liquid and sophisticated bond markets, based on which local currency-based derivatives markets will also grow. Lessons for Asian bankers, which have done well to avoid excessive direct damage from the current crisis, is to start building more robust risk management and internal control infrastructure as manufacturer of financial products. Take these functions within the bank seriously as Asian banking grows in size as well as sophistication, particularly with the expected growth in capital markets. As provider of financial services and products, the lesson is do not sell what we cannot honestly explain and or what doesn't suit the needs or risk profile of our customers. And as investor, don't buy what we don't understand. And maybe there's a lesson for the Asian regulators as well, which is don't fall behind the curve of developments in the market, both product development and sales practices. The American and most European regulators fell far behind the market when the credit bubble burst. The second topic is on the US dollar liquidity problem as it particularly related to Korea and some other East Asian countries that had significant amount of US dollar debt from American and European banks. And the analogy I draw is a little more upbeat than Chairman Hyun's analogy to funeral, which is be careful when choosing your lenders. The nature of fear that gripped Korea following the collapse of Lehman Brothers last September and lasted perhaps until this April or May is akin to the anxiety of a businessman whose bankers started to pull loans overnight. Not so much because the business was going sour, but more because the bank's own liquidity problem was reaching a crisis level. Very briefly, US dollar liquidity started to dry up as large US financial institutions stopped to lend to each other except on an overnight basis and reduce their high leverage, while setting up huge reserves to account for deteriorating subprime and CDS-based assets. U.S. government moved in to inject liquidity into major financial institutions, also to keep them solvent. Korean banks' foreign currency assets totaled about US dollar 150 billion at the end of 2008. And that was about 12% of the total asset. Since the Asian financial crisis of 97 and 98, all Korean banks run more or less matched foreign currency book. And total foreign currency liabilities were also around US dollar 150 billion at the end of 2008. And starting from August 2008, Korean banks started to face severe problems rolling over the foreign currency liabilities. Most of these liabilities were in the form of borrowing from major international banks, and the tenor became extremely short and pricing exorbitant. But by most measure of financial soundness, Korea was a quality credit. Korean banks at the end of June 2008 had average BIS ratio of more than 10%, tangible common equity ratio of above 5%, NPL ratio of less than 0.8%, and were leveraged at less than 17 times of net worth. Korean corporations had a debt-to-equity ratio of less than 1.3 times. The country's national debt was 30% of GDP at the end of 2008. Foreign currency reserves at the end of 2008 amounted to US dollar 230 billion. Although the country was coming down from a 3-year growth cycle starting around late 2007, the banking sector, the corporate sector, and the country's budget position were all relatively strong when the US dollar liquidity crunch hit Korea. Korea solved this problem starting with a $30 billion currency swap provided by the US government in October last year, followed by 2 more swaps of the same size each with China and Japan, which provided stability in the local currency strength and some room for sovereign debt financing. The point I'd like to highlight is that Korea was basically a sound going concern. American and European lenders were withdrawing their loans to address their own liquidity and solvency problem. Maybe and hopefully we don't face this type of global crisis again in our generation. But the lesson I take away as a banker is banker for Asian bankers is first, keep your foreign currency loan book relatively small. And secondly, diversify more the currency of your liabilities and the nationality of your lenders. Unlike the Asian financial crisis of 10 years ago, the Japanese banks who were most aggressive in withdrawing their loans to Korean banks. Japanese banks stayed put and was a great help to Korean banks. So when a liquidity or solvency-based crisis emerge again next time and affect Asia, I think Asian bankers will do better when we have more borrowings from more stronger lenders and more geographically diversified group of lenders. Thank you.
Thanks, CW. I'll step into the role of a panelist and speak briefly about China. China has been at the heart of the crisis and the heart of global recovery from the crisis, along with Japan. Japan's role was more important. Other Asian countries in the Middle East, the world experienced a great wave of liquidity. The story of the crisis is Eastern liquidity, Western mismanagement. The Chinese part was that inexpensive Chinese goods kept U.S. inflation low, therefore short-term interest rates low. The availability of liquidity from China and Japan, other Asian countries in the Middle East, kept long-run interest rates low at a time when normally in a less globalized situation, U.S. interest rates would have been pushed up by our domestic mismanagement. And therefore, asset prices rose, stock prices, house prices, in spectacular ways. So you had a global mismatch here. I have to say none of the proposals that governments are making about bank regulation and other matters are dealing with the fact that we now have a globalized flow of liquidity, but national management of monetary policy. And to me, that says that we are at great risk, that this crisis is just a small version of the next crisis, unless our policymakers face up to much bigger issues. Well, where was China going into this crisis? It had a special problem. China was experiencing very rapidly rising inflation from 0 to over 8% in about 2 years. At the same time, it was experiencing a wave of bankruptcies. In America, we think of that as a Jimmy Carter problem, have both inflation and increasing unemployment. When that happens, it shows that there's a structural problem. What was China's structural problem? Well, China has had two incredibly successful growth strategies. One was building infrastructure, heavy industry, roads, ports, petrochemicals, steel, aluminum. And when that was focused on building the highway from Shanghai to Beijing, it paid off immediately. Productivity rose. Later, that strategy was focused on building very large shopping malls in very small towns, and total factor productivity went to 0 or negative. So that had run its course. The other strategy was making toys and socks that mainly leveraged China's cheap labor. Labor costs were going through the roof, as they have in all of China's predecessors. The process of making cheap socks started in North Carolina in the United States and moved to Japan and to Korea and down to Indonesia. And the time comes when it's time to do something else. But China kept at that a bit too long, so it was experiencing this wave of bankruptcies. And it was a bit slow to react to the need for a new strategy. What should the new strategy be? Well, it has to be based on higher value-added manufacturing, services, small and medium enterprises rather than giant state enterprises, private enterprises. The transition has been very slow, but they finally started making the transition. Part of that was letting the renminbi float upward a bit. Part of it was a new labor law, but because those responses were delayed a few years too long, China found itself with a combination of inflation, radically higher labor costs, a strengthening currency, and a collapse of demand. So, for instance, by October of last year, the toy factory of the world had 53% of all its toy companies go bankrupt. There's a political aspect to this financial and economic dilemma that China finds itself in. Each phase of Chinese growth has required stepping back from a level of political control in return for a great wave of economic development. Deng Xiaoping allowed the rural communes to be replaced by family control, and that gave up one of the greatest levers of political control in Chinese history. But Chinese farmer incomes sextupled, and Chinese politics as well as economics benefited from that. Under Zhu Rongji, the state gave up a lot of control of urban enterprise. Not all of it, but a lot. And again, there was this great wave. In order to make the current transition, the state is going to have to give up control of financial markets. And that, again, is a huge, frightening, risk-fraught decision which the government has been hesitant to make. So this is how China found itself in the middle of this is China's domestic situation as the financial crisis hit. What has the response been? Massive fiscal stimulus, first of all, much more decisive than the rest of the world. Only China and the United States really were decisive enough in this crisis. And China's stimulus was much better targeted than America's. The Obama stimulus is mostly a social transformation program and small part stimulus. Chinese real stimulus. Huge flood of bank loans. All major property developers bailed out. So tremendous success at reviving the economy. Economic growth rates up to about 8% again. Substantial stock market rebound. Land prices in major cities are at their bubble peaks. Now that's a success. That's also a potential problem because the speculative property developers were all bailed out. They're back into full speculative bubble mode again. The banks are going to have substantial non-performing loans. It used to be that the central government held back the local governments from investing in all sorts of crazy shopping malls and so on. For the last year, the central government has been telling the local governments, how come you're only building that many shopping malls? The small and medium enterprises on whom the future depends have been seriously damaged. So there's no question about China's success in coping with the financial crisis. There's an interesting question mark when it will articulate the strategy that moves away from the very successful but obsolete strategies of the past to a new growth path. In the meantime, this has had an enormous positive impact on China's international role. China has emerged very clearly as the partner of the U.S. in Asia, heavily at Japan's expense. That was happening for a decade before the crisis. I wrote a book about that last year before the crisis started. But now people are in 2000, people are talking about the Armitage Report. let's pay less attention to China and make Japan the center of the Asian universe. Now they're talking about the G2, the United States and China. Throughout the world, China's leadership and decisiveness has given its stature. Chinese demand has rescued places like Brazil, along with Argentina, a lot of the rest of Latin America, Indonesia, much of Africa. For the first time in history, as far as I can tell, Latin America is not the worst part of the world in the crisis. It's doing pretty well. Why? Well, a lot of the reason is Chinese demand. And the result is a broad rise in China's stature and role in both the world economy and world politics. As I say, there are reasonable questions about how sustainable that is. It depends on what this generation of leaders does to take China to the new level. But for the time being, that's the result. We turn now to Mr. Deripaska. We're extremely grateful for how far he's traveled to be with us. He is one of the great Russian billionaires. He's remained a billionaire through the gangster wars, through the financial crisis. Not many others have. He owns the largest aluminum company in the world, a great automobile manufacturer, an aircraft manufacturer, and many others. And we're happy to have him with us.
Crisis was quite a serious lesson for Russia, and it's not finished. Just for the reference, 3/4 of Russian territory, in Asia, and it's only 25% of our population. Sorry. Sorry. Crisis was quite a serious lesson, and it wouldn't be easy to finish this lesson. And I just want to further reference, said that 3/4 of Russian territory based in Asia, most of resources, also, far beyond Urals, and only 25% of population, which, less than 30 million people, live in that part of Russia. From one side, we, experience very dramatic fall in the GDP. It's already, more than 11%, and it's maybe another, 5-6% to come by the end of the year. With quite a high inflation, which lower than the last year, but still above 12%. High interest rates and a dramatic fall in reserves. We lost maybe around 22% of central bank reserves in the